Books, books. I like books. I'm gonna read them all.
Hi readers, Chris here. Welcome to my channel where I review fantasy, Stephen King, all sorts of books, and today I'm going to be talking about my Stephen King journey. Most of you, I'm sure, already know this, but in case you're new here, I am on a journey to read all of Stephen King's books by publication date. So I started with Carrie, that was published back in the 70s, and I'm working my way all the way through, which gets harder and harder because he keeps coming out with more and more books. But today I want to focus on the 90s because, yes, I have finished reading all 12 novels that Stephen King published in the 90s, plus his short story collections, and now I'm on the 2000s. But I want to recap my experience reading Stephen King's books from the 90s. I'm going to put chapter times down below, but I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite books from this decade, some of my least favorite books from this decade, and just kind of what this decade has meant to me overall. So let's start with kind of the 90s overall. In the 80s, Stephen King wrote a lot of books that really focused on the supernatural, because this was really when he cemented himself as a horror author. So I'm talking about things like It, Pet Sematary, Christine. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it's not to say that there isn't supernatural stuff in the 90s. There definitely is. But I can feel like you can really see a shift in his storytelling from this really supernatural monster type storytelling to a much more grounded storytelling. The stories in the 90s, not all of them, but a lot of them really focus on the horror of everyday life and the horror of regular people and the horrors of what sometimes people can do to each other. So let's start with that main theme, the horror of what people do to each other. When I look at his 90s works and I look at stories like Gerald's Game, The Green Mile, Dolores Claiborne, and a lot of these stories, it's not, the horror of the story doesn't come from a supernatural element. It doesn't come from a Pennywise the clown or an undead crazy person. It really comes from the horrors that some people have to live with every day. So, for example, in Dolores Claiborne, we have a woman who's being physically abused by her husband. Horrific. In Gerald's Game, we have a girl that was sexually assaulted by her father. Horrific. In The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, we have a young girl lost in the woods. That's a terrifying experience if you've ever been lost somewhere. None of these things are supernatural. There's no monsters. The monster, though, is really a person, or sometimes it's just like your own mind creates a monster out of nothing. And I think that's a really cool switch because it really shows that Stephen King has skill as an author outside of just these monster stories. His horror is not just about monsters. His horror really shines a light on the horror of ordinary people and their ordinary lives, which I think is super cool. The other thing that I think really shines through in the 90s is his strong female characters. Now, don't get me wrong, he definitely has strong female characters in the 80s. Obviously, there was Carrie and Annie Wilkes, the villain from Misery. But these are just average women who don't have any superpowers, but who are able to use their inner strength and their inner, their inner strength to really help themselves in their situations. So again, I specifically mentioned already Dolores Claiborne, Gerald's Game, Rose Madder. Even though I particularly didn't like Rose Madder, even I can understand that here's a woman, again, who's trying to escape an abusive relationship, and the only way that she can really do that is by really pulling on her inner strength. The young girl from The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And even when you look at a book like Wizard and Glass, which is a book in the Dark Tower series. Like, it's this huge fantasy, epic fantasy series. But we have this character in Susan Delgado, who is a young girl. She doesn't have any superpowers. She kind of finds herself in this really horrifying situation. And yeah, she really has to like dig deep and rely on the strength of herself and her character to try and, I won't say get out of it exactly, but to survive as much as she can. So all of these things together, all of these themes, I think really make the 90s an exciting time for Stephen King. I said this earlier, but I'm just going to say it again to kind of wrap this section up. But I think the 90s really cemented that Stephen King had skill as an author outside of just monster stories. Yes, there are monsters in these stories, but they're not crazy evil clowns. They're not killers from outer space. They're not undead people. The monsters in these stories, a lot of them are regular people, which is both fascinating and horrifying at the same time, which I think is one of the things that Stephen King does best. So now I'm going to talk about some of my favorite books of the 90s, and I'm not going to go too in depth. I do have reviews, like reviews for all of these books that I will put in my description box below if you want to do more. I've already talked about a number of these. If I had to pick one book that was my favorite of the decade, it's probably going to be Gerald's Game. I love Gerald's Game almost as much as I love Misery. Like, it's a really close tie between the two of them because I love a book that works on multiple levels. And this book works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's a very simple story about a woman who finds herself handcuffed to a bed. She's alone in the cabin in the middle of the woods. She has no one to save herself but herself. But the story is so much more layered than that. There is layers to this story, layers upon layers upon layers. Not only does this woman need to free herself physically, but she also needs to free herself mentally and emotionally from a trauma that she is dealing with. And I just love that stuff. I love how the physical, the mental, and the emotional all work together. A story with a strong female character, which, yes, I am partial to. I totally admit that. I'm biased to strong female characters, and we definitely have one here. So, yes, this is my favorite book of the 90s, hands down, but there are definitely some close seconds. Close second being The Green Mile. The Green Mile, I feel like, is one of those stories that even if you're not into horror, even if you're not a Stephen King fan, everyone can read The Green Mile. Everyone. You do not have to be in horror. In fact, if you're someone that doesn't like horror, this is the King book that you should read, The Green Mile, this one, because this book is so grounded. Basically, we have a guy, John Coffey, that gets accused of murdering these two young white girls. He's this big black guy. He gets brought into this prison where he is going to spend his last days before he gets the electric chair. And this is the story of what happens when one officer that works in this prison really gets to know this man and kind of finds out who he is, how he ended up in this situation, and what can he do about it. This book is like illustrates everything that I've been talking about. This is a book about the horror of how people treat each other, the horror that happens in everyday life, and because of the time period this book takes place in, it really explores the horrors of racism, of prejudice, of privilege. Like, oh my God, there is so much that goes into this book. It's beautiful, it is heartbreaking, it's horrifying, and it is absolutely one of King's best stories. Another favorite of mine that I already mentioned, Dolores Claiborne. I really love this book because this book is basically one woman telling a story about how she came to kill her husband. And again, this is one of those stories that on the surface, it's like, well, of course you shouldn't kill anyone. Clearly this woman was unhinged and she did something wrong. But as Dolores tells her story and you hear her story and you understand what she went through and what was happening, I think by the end, maybe you don't agree with what she did, but I think you can understand. You can understand how someone can be pushed so far and so hard that they do something horrifying. Like, I think you can really understand how that could happen. And that's just brilliant. The fact that King, and this book isn't even that long compared to some of his books. Like, this book is just over 300 pages. The fact that within about 300 pages, he can put you inside of a woman's mind who has been terrified and thereby did a terrible thing, but you can understand and feel sympathetic towards her. I mean, that's just brilliant. That's just brilliant writing right there, and I love it. Another book I want to mention in my favorite section here is a little bit different, and that is Needful Things. Now, this book was written in the early 90s, 1991, I believe, so it still does have some of those quote-unquote supernatural elements that King is known for and that he used in his 80s books. The thing I like about this book then, even though there is a supernatural element, the story itself and the main characters are just regular people. They're just regular people. And one thing I really noticed about this book, like, I always knew in my head that Stephen King's books all kind of take place in the same universe and there's little Easter eggs to other stories in the books. But this is the first book that, like, I really felt that as a Stephen King fan, that I was being rewarded. I was being rewarded for reading all of his books because of this one. Because there are so many Easter eggs in this book for prior works. There's characters in here that appeared in prior books. There's places. This takes place in Castle Rock, which is a really famous Stephen King location for a bunch of his books. There's just so many things in here that reference earlier stories, and if you hadn't read all of them, you wouldn't get those references. It may not change your enjoyment of the book. I think you can still read this book without having to have read all of the other ones, but if you have read all of the other ones, it really does feel like you got like a little treasure. Like, it feels good, it feels rewarding. So I really love that this book rewards you for being a fan, and I don't think that Needful Things gets enough credit for that. And then finally, one other book I wanted to mention really quick was Wizard and Glass. This is the fourth book in King's The Dark Tower series. Now, he started the series in the 80s with The Gunslinger, The Drawing of Three, and then in the 90s, he published The Wastelands and Wizard and Glass. I would say I can't imagine what it would have been like back then waiting for these books to come out, but as a Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire fan, yeah, I can understand it was probably frustrating. Now, out of all the Dark Tower books I've read so far, and this is only the fourth one, this one is definitely my favorite. Again, I went really into depth on why, but let's just say that this book is a story within a story, and it's just so much fun. Everything that I like about stories in general, stories that are filled with action, humor, heart, romance, horror, like, my favorite stories have a little bit of everything mixed together, and that's what I feel this book does. So if you're wondering whether or not you should get into the Dark Tower series, I do think everyone should give it a try. I will warn that The Gunslinger is probably the weakest of all of the Dark Tower books, which is a shame because it's the first. But if you can get through that one, then you will be well on your way to reading some really great stuff. So those are all my favorite books of the decade. Now for my least favorite, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't want to be too negative, but Rose Madder. Unfortunately, I do think that not only for the 90s, but I personally feel like this may be the worst book King has ever written so far. And it's a shame because I do think that the first half of this book is actually really good. It's really good. It's about this woman running from an abusive man who is a cop, and the cop, you get chapters from his point of view as he's stalking her, and then you get chapters from her point of view as she's running away, and it's really cool and it's really exciting. But then at the end, it takes this grounded real life story and it turns into a supernatural mess. And I absolutely hated that. It makes me angry that this book took such a left turn, because it was pretty good up until this point. And to me, that's like the biggest, like, how can you take a book that was going so well and then just totally like, I don't know. That is just how I felt though. So yeah, unfortunately, Rose Madder, not one of my favorites. Also, something that was disappointing to me is Desperation, and then a little bit The Regulators. I do like The Regulators. I like it more than Desperation. This one, I think, was just disappointing to me. Like, I had these two books, Desperation and The Regulators, for so long, and I was really looking forward to reading them because I knew one was a companion novel to the other. You get the two covers, they go together, they make a nice big picture. It's a chunky book, and I don't know what it is about this one. Like, I don't even remember it that well. I feel like I kind of blocked it out of my mind, if I'm being honest, but this book, again, is another one of those that started out really cool and then just kind of went off the deep end for me. So that's really what I'm going to say. Similar to Rose Madder, started good, went off the deep end, and left me feeling disappointed. Another one that left me feeling disappointed was Bag of Bones. I just reviewed this one recently, so I'm not going to talk about it in depth here. All I will say is that there's really like two different storylines in this book. This is something that King does often, and the storyline that I feel was better was not the main storyline. I felt like the main storyline was really weak. I thought the B storyline was much better, but unfortunately the story focused on the A storyline and ultimately left me feeling blah. And finally, the two books that I really haven't mentioned in this video are the two short story collections that King released in the 90s. So let's start with 4 Past Midnight. This was actually published in 1990, and it's not a short story collection. It's a collection of 4 novellas, basically. There's The Langoliers, Secret Window, Secret Garden. I know there's one about a library cop, library policeman, and then The Sundog. This book is, it's okay. I feel like The Langoliers and Secret Window, those two stories I did enjoy, but the other 2 stories I hated. So that, again, leaves me feeling pretty blah about this one. And then the other book from the 90s is Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Ooh, the glare is really bad on that, sorry. This was published in 1993, and honestly, when I picked this book up to do this video and I glanced through it, I know I read this book. I know I read the whole thing. I could not tell you one story in here. Like, honestly, I think it's one of those books that I just kind of like glazed over and read it and nothing stuck out. The fact that nothing stuck out to me about this story should tell you right there, not one of my favorites. So those are the 2 collections that King published in the 90s, which I think he published about 2 in the 80s, so that's pretty standard for him. So yeah, so I've talked about the themes of the 90s, my favorites of the 90s, my least favorites of the 90s. Before I end this video, I just want to do a special shout out to Insomnia. Why do I want to do a special shout out to Insomnia? If you saw my review, you will know that Insomnia is the first Stephen King book that I ever read in my entire life. And actually, this edition, this version right here, is the book that I read. I read this book back in the 90s. I don't think I read it the year it came out because I still would have been quite young then, but I definitely read this book when I was still in high school, and I graduated in 2021. So I could have read it in 2000, but I definitely read it when I was very, very young. And I don't know what it was about this story, but it really stuck with me and really set me on the path to like read more Stephen King. And I don't know, like I've always hung on to this book because I really, really liked it. Now, Insomnia was published in the 90s, 1994 to be exact, and I did reread it, not this edition, but I did reread another edition as part of my Stephen King journey. It didn't end up being a favorite, but it didn't end up being a least favorite either. I had remembered very little about the actual story. Like, I knew there were little bald guys and they cut people's threads, but that was about all I remembered. That book is way more in-depth than I ever realized. So even though it's not a favorite of mine personally, it's always going to have a special place in my heart and a special place in my collection because it's the first Stephen King book that I ever read. Okay, I think I've talked about enough Stephen King today. Roscoe says, are you a Stephen King fan? Yes, you're a Stephen King fan. Okay. So now I want to know from you, are you a Stephen King fan? Do you have a favorite King book from the 90s or a least favorite book? Let Roscoe and I know in the comments section below. And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already, please subscribe to my channel for more Stephen King and more furry friends coming your way soon. All right, everyone, happy reading.